Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. I think probably just about every viewer here, with maybe a few possible exceptions, is pretty familiar with the Aleutian goose, since it has inhabited Stanislaus County and the adjacent counties for decades, and we've known about it for about the last 50 years or so. It's an amazing story and one of our true triumphs for conservation in general. And I think we can all be very proud to have this bird in our backyards. So with that, I'll go ahead and start in. And I think I'm not going to try to go into the whole subspecies of Canada geese and cackling geese just yet, but we can discuss that at the end if people want to discuss that. I'll try to keep the presentation to about 40 minutes if possible and leave time for questions at the end. So I'll just jump right in. And I'd like to start off, I have Sal's permission to quote Sal Salerno from his Valley Habitat article in April of 2011, which has now been subsequently published in his volume 1 of Our Birds, Birders, and Birding. And the quote is as follows: "Stories about the survival of birds through human history can take on epic proportions, beginning with The Long and the Far Away. Unfortunately, their first chapters often chronicle human interference that causes environmental imbalances. Too often, the last chapters are grim, ending with the diminishment or even the extinction of birds. Once in a while, however, the story that begins tragically unfolds into a redemptive future." So that's really a great lead in that I got Sal's permission, because it kind of just encapsulates the whole story in a really great way. And the story of the Aleutian goose is truly amazing. The story stretches through time from the Aleutian Islands to the Northern California and Oregon coast and the Central Valley, and it features many conservation heroes, a few of which I will try to weave into our presentation tonight. So let's get going.
You gotta click on the page.
Okay, there we go. So the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge is a rugged landscape comprised of about 3.4 million acres across about 2,500 Aleutian islands, an area so remote that many people have never heard of them. The islands are arching from the end of the Alaskan Peninsula to just short of the Kamchatka Peninsula in the Russian Far East. This area is a treeless tundra of snow-colored peaks, rocky coastlines, sandy beaches, muskeg ponds, and kelp beds and coral reefs that provide a profusion of life, including over 450 types of fish, 26 species of marine mammals, and 40 million individual birds comprising about 30 species, which amazingly include about 80% of our North American's nesting birds. The Aleutian Islands are so vast, it's kind of hard to comprehend, but to put it in perspective, if we were to superimpose the island chain on the lower 48, you can see what would happen. You would have to go from the Dakotas to the Oregon coast. So that just kind of puts things in perspective. There's about 5 groups of islands that are named. The most furthest westerly are named the Near Islands, named by the Russians because they were nearest to their home Russia. Next are the Rat Islands, the Andreanof Islands, the Islands of Four Mountains, and the Fox Islands are closest to the Alaska Peninsula. Native Aleut people fished and hunted these waters for thousands of years. The area has few land mammals, so the majority of their subsistence was probably marine resources like salmon, halibut, sea mammals, and shellfish. Unfortunately, the Aleut people had to be evacuated when World War II set in. And the Japanese landings and occupation of Kiska and Attu Islands in June of 1942 were two invasions within the United States during World War II. Numerous battles and skirmishes occurred on the islands and included the bombing of Dutch Harbor. The islands are home to, as we mentioned, 30 species of nesting seabirds, including auklets, puffins, terns, and cormorants, in addition to the Aleutian geese. These nesting birds are estimated to number almost 40 million. Pretty amazing. Sadly, though, past human meddling on the islands became home to a number of non-native species that were released either intentionally or inadvertently over the past 250 years. Most egregious of these non-native unwelcome visitors include the Arctic and red foxes, which were first introduced by the earliest Russian fur traders, a practice that would continue for nearly 200 years during the fur trading era. Between 1750 and 1936, foxes were introduced to over 190 islands. These non-native foxes became the main reason for the near extinction of the Aleutian cackling goose. And it's worth noting that the Aleutian goose, as well as all these nesting birds, have no natural defenses to the foxes or other predators because they simply didn't adapt with them over time. Attu Island, one of the largest islands in the Aleutian chain and located at the far western end of the American portion of the Aleutians, is an enormous island. And in 1906, nesting was still occurring, was still documented to occur throughout most of this island, and the Aleutian geese were considered to be the most abundant bird on the island at that time. The fur trading, which occurred up until about the 1930s and then collapsed in about 1936, resulted in the cessation of trapping of the Aleutian geese. So the fox population probably soared even more than what it was already had with the lack of trapping. And by 1937, Ollis Murray searched the for Aleutian cackling geese on Attu Island, but found only a few pairs. So in that span of time, only about 30 years, the geese on Attu Island went from being a very numerous species of bird to they could hardly find any of them. So that gives an indication of what was probably happening across the whole Aleutian chain. But of course, this area is so vast that there weren't very many eyes out there looking or paying attention. By the 1940s and 50s, the goose was thought to be extinct. It simply was not seen by many people, the few people who were out there. In addition, of course, millions of other nesting birds were also being wiped out by these foxes. Then Bob Sea Otter Jones rediscovered this species to be nesting on Boulder Island in 1962. Now, Bob Jones is an incredible hero of conservation, and really just, I need to do him justice by reading some reflections from Vernon Baird, who became the supervisory biologist later. And Vernon reflected on his memory of Sea Otter Jones during the Aleu-tian Canada goose endangered species delisting ceremony. So I'm reading from Vernon Baird that Robert Jones was an uncommon man. As a young Army officer during World War II, Jones was among the first troops to go ashore at Adak in the central Aleutian Islands, that arc of submarine volcanoes that extends from Alaska towards Siberia. He loved the treeless tundra. From the fierce winds, he found the fierce winds invigorating and saw the snow-covered volcanic peaks as needing to be climbed. Before the war, Jones graduated from South Dakota State University with a degree in biology. And in spite of the war, it was obvious to him how rich the area was in wildlife. He was hired to be the first resident manager of the Aleutian Islands National Wildlife Refuge in 1947. an area that would later become the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge. One of Jones's priorities was to try to remove the introduced foxes from Amchitka Island. He selected that island because of its extensive wetlands and grassy meadows, on the off chance that the Aleutian geese would still remain there and could be saved from extinction. With little more than his dory and his amazing energy and persistence, he spent the better part of 10 summers removing every last fox from Amchitka Island. Then in 1962, Jones got a Coast Guard cutter to drop him off near Boulder Island, where he rediscovered a nesting population of Aleutian geese. And from there, the recovery efforts began. His work proved to be the basis of the formal recovery program that would come. So that's Bob Jones, who's probably single-handedly responsible for the fact that we still see geese, the Aleutian cackling geese today. So Boulder Island, that one unique fox-free island of the Aleutian chain, is a rather small island with a very rugged coast and often very high surf, to the extent that I guess the fur traders didn't think it was worth hazarding to try to land there to introduce foxes. So the Aleutian geese persisted there. And next, we're going to talk about Vernon Beard, who took over the reins of the Aleutian Goose Recovery Program where Bob Jones left off. He had a very distinguished career spanning more than 30 years with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He worked on seabirds, marine mammals, waterfowl, and endangered species on 5 refuges in Alaska. He developed protocols for monitoring seabird populations and trends, and authored numerous scientific publications. His leadership and scientific expertise in invasive species management led to the successful recolonization of many islands by nesting birds, most notably the Aleutian Canada goose. Dennis Wollington carried out his graduate work at Humboldt State University under Professor Dr. Paul Springer. He studied the migration and wintering ecology of the Aleutian goose from 1975 to 1978, and he rediscovered the wintering population on 2 cattle ranches west of Modesto. Dennis, as many of our viewers know, went on to become the supervisory wildlife biologist at the San Luis Refuge Complex, where he continued his work on Aleutian geese, as well as many other refuge wildlife resources. So as foxes were cleared from some of these Aleutian islands, namely some of the ones that are closer to Boulder Island that we see here, attempts were made to translocate these geese from Boulder Island to other nearby islands. And this involved capturing the females on the nest as well as their goslings. They would initially try to raise them in captivity to be relocated, but they didn't take too well to being kept in pens, and those efforts were largely unsuccessful. But later they found that they could just take the whole family unit to the other islands that were now fox-free and simply release them on site. The mother would stay with the goslings and basically successfully raise them to adulthood for migration. What we see here are biologists carrying these net loops to capture the female on the nest. And the guys with the backpacks on that kind of have these funny contents, those are 3 cages that are used to transport the goose and the goslings to the next islands. Some other conservation heroes out on the Aleutian train are Steve Everett and Jeff Williams, who I actually got to meet early in my career at a refuge conference in South Carolina, actually. Incredible guys of just determination and stamina. So Jeff and Steve continued the work where Vernon left off of removing foxes from other islands. Again, just think of how many miles of sea that you have to cross to reach these islands. So it's no small feat. And 190 fox islands is a tall order, but these guys stayed at it and they continued to remove foxes from these islands, and the geese have recovered. So here is an indication of, you can see if I can get my cursor there, here is Bull Deer Island near the far western end of the chain. Some of the other islands were Niski and Attu and Amchitka were the next ones to have geese reintroduced to them. I recently contacted Jeff Williams, who still works out, who is now the deputy project leader for the Alaska Maritime, and he indicated that to me that these are the islands that now have geese nesting on them. The yellow ones indicated in yellow are confirmed nesting islands of the geese, including Attu, that largest of outer islands. The ones in blue are probably have nesting geese, but they haven't yet been confirmed. So now let's talk about how far, sort of the overall range of the Aleutian goose. People have known for a long time that they not only migrate to the lower 48 states of the North America, but they also migrate east and south towards Japan, and some geese still do nest in Japan. What we see here is a map of eBird records, and a lot of our viewers are eBirders, and this map will look familiar to them. But for those of you who are not eBirders, the color code on the right-hand side kind of tends to show a relative abundance. The darker the markers on the map, the more relative Aleutian goose sightings there are for those areas. What we see here is a smattering of probably rare bird sightings in more northern Alaska and in Canada and the Midwest, and even one over in New Jersey. And interestingly enough, there's even a few rare bird sightings even on the Hawaiian Islands. So it's pretty amazing that unless somebody flew them over there in their suitcase, that even these Aleutian geese are apparently really just flying all over the Pacific. But their main migration, as we'll talk about next, generally goes, let me just mention, there's two distinct populations of Aleutian goose. The main population nests in the central and far westerly Aleutian Islands that we just saw. And then there's a second kind of a unique, distinct population that nest in 2 or 3 islands called the Samiti Islands that are closer to Kodiak, Alaska. And this population is thought to migrate separately and has a separate winter home range near Pacific City, Oregon, and on the Nestucca National Wildlife Refuge and surrounding areas. The other populations are the ones that we know, and is a much larger population, and those are the populations that end up in California. So let's briefly talk about that Samiti Island population. They fly to oceanic, possibly a few of them fly along the coastline across southern Alaska and Canada, but most of them probably do an oceanic flight directly to the northern Oregon coast. The Nestucca Bay National Wildlife Refuge does do specific management for the Aleutian cackling geese there. They have a cooperative arrangement with 1 or more dairy farmers, and they do specific habitat management for the geese. And I know historically these geese, when they needed to roost for the night, they would actually roost on the Haystack Rock that's famous for the puffin sightings. So that's the far northern Samiti population. Now we'll get to the main population. Many of you are aware that Del Norte and Humboldt County have been the main migratory corridors for both the the northern migration to the north, the spring migration, they stage. Historically, they've stayed specifically in Del Norte County near Crescent City, and Castle Rock has been a place where the geese would roost at night. It was protected as part of the Humboldt Bay National Wildlife Refuge in 1979. And other areas like Lake Earl were protected partially for the Aleutian geese in 1980. So this is a very unique area where the geese make landfall on their southward migration across the ocean. They'll land anywhere from southern Oregon, like Bandon Marsh, down through Del Norte County and Humboldt County. But historically, Del Norte County was sort of the core of their spring and fall migration staging areas before they went to the valley. Now, the North Coast has had, as the population of Aleutian geese has increased over the years due to all the efforts, mainly up in the Aleutian Islands, but also protecting habitat in our lower 48. As the population increased, there's been some overachievement and problems due to overabundance that perhaps were not foreseen in the early efforts to recover the species. And mainly the problems are on small dairy farms in Humboldt and Del Norte County. So many of the dairy farmers, when the populations were only at 500 or so, weren't affecting their bottom line and their pockets too much. But when the geese got to be 20, 30, 40,000 and more, it became apparent that it was not good for their grazing lands. If you can't read this sign, it basically says Aleutian geese not on private property. So the farmers were not too happy. They began efforts to haze the geese off of their properties, largely with permission and permits from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in cooperation, using noisemaker guns, ATVs for hazing, and even light aircraft. So agencies and landowners have gotten together over the past 20 to 30 years and come up with ways to try to lessen the impacts on private grazing property and to try to get the geese to use more public lands. And so there's been a lot of projects to improve habitat on public lands and make it more beneficial for the geese and less impacts on private lands. I think we see Lake Earl here in the background. In 2006, I was fortunate to attend an Aleutian Goose Festival in Crescent City. And there were a number of superstars in the Aleutian Goose Conservation Recovery Program that were there. Professor Paul Springer, who taught at Humboldt State University in the 70s and 80s. He was Dennis Wollington's professor when he did his work. Margaret Mehring is Bob Sea Otter Jones's sister, who I had the pleasure to meet and become quite good friends. In fact, the painting that we see behind me is a painting that Margaret Mehring purchased at this ceremony and gave to me later on. Dominic Bachman did his master's thesis on Aleutian geese under Dr. Jeff Black at Humboldt State University, and Dr. Black has had a number of graduate students who have also done work on Aleutian geese, and of course, Dennis Wollington. With all the disturbance of the geese and trying to get them to move off of private dairies up in Del Norte County, over a number of years of trying to do that resulted in the geese basically shifting their main habitat use on the North Coast southward down to Humboldt County. So when I went to college at Humboldt State in the 1980s, this was a site we did not see, but going back to visit there now in the last 10 to 20 years, it's been really amazing to see all the geese out on these pastures. Humboldt Bay National Wildlife Refuge, established in 1971, has also done a lot to try to improve habitat on the refuge, to encourage the geese to use the refuge and not so much private lands. They've done a lot of work to try to make the grazing for the geese better, and including they've done some experiments on soil fertility, adding amendments to the soil to try to get the grass to be more nutritious. And so a lot of this research has been done by the refuge staff in cooperation with Humboldt State University students. Moving further south, historically, the Butte Sink and the farmlands around Calusa were a major migratory stopover and even part of their wintering range for the Aleutian Canada geese. However, more recently, the geese either seem to not be stopping here for very long or bypassing it entirely. In fact, I think the majority of geese often take more of a coastal route down to the Bay Area and come into the Delta and the San Joaquin River Refuge and actually bypassing the Butte Sink. But nevertheless, there still is some goose use in the Sacramento Valley, just not as much as there was historically. Another big area for goose use here in the Central Valley is the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta. Many of us are aware that this is the hub of our water use for California, and there's many controversies and issues surrounding water in California. Nevertheless, these farmlands out in the Delta, which are quite vast, numbers of islands, the geese make good use and they move around in the Delta quite a bit, including even as far east as Grizzly Island. Where I live in Tracy, sometimes I'll go out at night and I'll hear the geese flying over my house. And they're always either headed towards the Delta or back towards the refuge. Now we get to the San Joaquin River National Wildlife Refuge, where I have worked for a long time, as it was mentioned by Sal. And the refuge is part of the San Luis National Wildlife Refuge Complex, established in 1987, specifically for a wintering ground for the Aleutian geese. It was expanded in 1999 in the aftermath of the 97 flood south of Highway 132. It is a very diverse landscape, both geographically and biologically. Lots of migratory birds, lots of resident species like the endangered riparian brush rabbit. The current area is about 7,200 acres in fee title that the refuge owns, but also about 3,500 acres of conservation easements. And I might add that the refuge was recently given approval to expand its boundaries north and south, and we are in the process of trying to acquire additional lands. The refuge has been the primary release site for riparian brush rabbits, and we've restored about 2,700 acres of riparian habitat over the last 15 years or so. Just a look back, as I mentioned in my flyer, the refuge has been established on a solid foundation of partnerships, which continue today. Looking back, the Faith Ranch, previously owned by Paul Davies, and the Mapes Ranch, previously owned by Ed Mapes, which now is his namesake for the ranch. Those persons graciously allowed the early researchers that were trying to document and count the Aleutian geese on their wintering grounds in the 1970s and 80s. People like Dennis Wollington were greeted onto these farmlands with open arms and allowed them not only to count the geese, but actually sometimes to stay overnight in a trailer. We need to give tribute to Joseph Long and Don Lundberg, who provided an enormous amount of funding to the California Audubon Society, which led to this initial establishment of the San Joaquin River National Wildlife Refuge. There's about 3,500 acres of conservation easements on the Faith and Mapes Ranch, which has had tremendous benefits for the geese and other species. The refuge has a cooperative management agreement with the Lions to get a lot of work done on the wildlife refuge that refuge staff, our small staff, would not be able to do, like farming the crops, the corn and the winter wheat, and the alfalfa that the geese use for their winter forage. That's all done with a cooperative management agreement. And also our grazing program, which benefits the geese and other migratory birds. The Stanislaus Audubon has been a tremendous partner over the years. They continue to be a vocal advocate for the refuge, help lead tours on the refuge, and foster public understanding through public outreach. And they've actually given money for bird boxes as well. Ducks Unlimited has done a lot of wetland restoration on the refuge for the benefit of the geese and other water birds. And the California Department of Wildlife has been in charge of winter surveys overall in the Central Valley, as well as the capture and mark program that's critical to our population estimates. Okay, I'm told I only have 10 minutes left, so I'm going to try to pick it up. Here are our refuge goals, and you can see the Aleutian Canada goose remains a priority for the refuge. We do a lot of habitat management for the benefit of the geese. Crops like winter wheat and alfalfa are critical forage early when they arrive in the fall, in September, in October and November. Later in the year, they switch to corn when it gets colder for more of a carbohydrate to put on fat in a warm coat during the cold months. Wetland habitats are always critical for their roosting, a place where they go to settle in for the night. Irrigated pastures and native uplands are also critical sources of protein grass for them during the spring migration and the fall. I wanted just to mention native grasslands in particular historically were, grazed by native ungulates like deer and elk. Today, we keep our native grasslands in a condition that's suitable for migratory birds by grazing cattle. And that also improves the habitat for vernal pool species as well. Look at the population growth over time of the Aleutian geese. So in the mid 1970s, just a few years after Bob Jones discovered the Aleutian geese on Boulder Island, they were known to be only a few hundred at the time. It took a while in the 1980s and early 90s. This is when the start of trying to remove foxes from the islands and establishing protected areas in the lower 48. And finally, you can see in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, all that work really started to pay off, and the population growth was gaining anywhere from 10% to 15% per year. Now, you can see from the graph over the last 10 years or so, the population does seem to be stabilizing at about anywhere between 160 to upwards of 200,000 birds. The last population count that was analyzed, the data was in 2000, and for some reason there was a slight drop in the numbers. I'm not sure how to explain that. So initially, let me just step back quickly. Initially, we could do direct counts, just drive out and look at flocks of birds and count them directly. But when the geese became too numerous, that was no longer going to provide an accurate count. So we had to resort to marking these birds to get a mark and recapture method, or we call it a mark and recite. And it's a simple algebraic equation comparing a marked population to an unmarked population, and you get a proportion, which helps you better estimate the overall population. So the way we capture these birds to get them marked is cannon rocket netting, and some of you may have volunteered to help us out with that. And it's really exciting when it happens, but there's actually a lot of waiting around for the geese to be just in the right position. Sometimes we'll go days without any luck at all. So it is very exciting when it happens. So the rockets are attached to basically a fishing net, and the charge propels the net over the top of a flock of geese, and hopefully we'll catch, if I can get my slide to forward. What have I done here?
Click in the picture.
There we go. So we'll often catch anywhere between 50 50 and 100 geese. And usually we target, hopefully they're mainly Aleutian geese in the nets. The geese are, oops, as soon as the nets are deployed, we rush out in our vehicles and secure the geese underneath the nets. We as quickly as possible, work in teams to get the geese into their own bag where they'll hopefully calm down and stay warm under cool weather. If it's warm out, we'll put them in the shade of a vehicle to try to keep them cool. And Dan Scalise with the California Fish and Wildlife is one of our meat, as well as Melanie Weaver are both the lead biologists with California Wildlife who are in charge of these operations. And we basically set up a conveyor belt where the geese are identified to age and sex. So we have a few people that are identifying the birds, and then the birds get marked and banded. So each bird gets its own unique collar with a code around its neck. And they also get a leg band, which is basically the social security number should the collar happen to fall off, which does occasionally happen. I do have to pay tribute to all of our amazing volunteers, not just the folks who work on the Aleutian goose banding, but here Doug Ridgway, Lee Whitmer is listening in. Thank you, Lee. They do an amazing job all the time, but we also have a number of volunteers that come out just for the Aleutian goose, including Elaine Gorman listening in. So wanted to just a big shout out to all the volunteers that you also make the refuge what it is. And they keep clicking the wrong button.
Yeah.
So just going back to our population graph, the marking of the geese is what allows us to come up with these more accurate estimations that would not be possible without the marking of the geese. Here's an indication of how many geese we have actually banded and neck collared over the years. From 1995, most of the banding has been done during the fall and winter months. A few of it has been done during the summer months on the Aleutian Islands. We've banded over 6,000 geese over the years since 1995. If anyone sights an Aleutian cackling geese with a collar around its neck and you're able to read the exact code of a collar, it's always going to be 3 digits, often a letter or two with numbers. Sometimes it's all numbers or all letters. If you're able to read that code and send it to the bird banding lab, there's a website where you can enter the information and you'll get all the information back on where it came from and how old it is. I just wanted to touch on mortality factors. And as we know, the population is starting to stabilize. So what are some of the factors that are limiting the population or stabilizing at this time? I believe that mortality from disease is probably one of the main causes of mortality. And here at the San Joaquin River Refuge, we do have avian cholera outbreaks that are happen almost every year. And this graph is an indication of that. Some years it's pretty heavy, up to 800 or 900 losses. These are not Aleutian geese. These are all migratory birds, including geese, ducks, and even a few shorebirds. Most of this mortality is happening at San Joaquin River Refuge, although some of this mortality is happening at the other refuges, Merced and San Luis. Oops. Other forms of mortality, avian predators take a big toll. More and more often we see bald eagles and golden eagles, as well as peregrine falcons and prairie falcons at the refuge. They, as well as red-tailed hawks, northern harriers. Well, northern harriers probably don't take the geese, but they try to. These avian predators are a big source of predation. And hunting was legalized in 2003. It started off, the hunting season for geese was a very conservative, only two geese per day, and I think 4 in possession. And that as the population has continued to grow and as problems on private lands in the North Coast have continued, the hunting quota has been liberalized to 10 per day. And yet that doesn't seem to be adversely affecting the population. So in summary, I'm just going to wrap it up. And I see I'm about at 40 minutes. This is just a recap of the major milestones to the Goose's road to recovery, from some of the earliest sightings in 1906 on Attu Island. 1937 was some of the last sightings of the goose before it was rediscovered by Bob Jones on Boulder Island. It was listed it was one of the first species listed in 1967 under the then Endangered Species Protection Act, which later in 1972 became the Endangered Species Act, which provided even more protection to endangered species. Many of you will know that the species was downlisted to only threatened in 1990 as the population grew, and then it was delisted from the Endangered Species Act in 2001. The species still has protection under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. As we note, hunting is allowed, and yet the population has still continued to climb to nearly 200 that we see today. So I think with that, I'm going to open it up to questions. We could discuss other subspecies if we want to, but I think for now, I'm just going to open it up to questions.